questions that are around capital and obviously revenue funding. And as you know, Pontypridd and Rhondda really took the brunt in February. And obviously we were very grateful for the support and also for the funding that was available for immediate works that needed doing. But I'd like to start off then about that. And as you know, Rhondda have assessed, for example, the amount of repair and infrastructure work that needs to be carried out at around £70 million. And obviously the overall figure, including other areas, is substantially higher as well. The Prime Minister, you will know, made an unequivocal promise that the money for infrastructure and repair work would be passported through to the Welsh Government. That is a promise that was openly endorsed by the Secretary of State for Wales. Can you just tell us whether you have received any of that money? And if not, what are you doing to get that money?
Thank you, Mick. And clearly your constituency was incredibly affected by the February storms. And you're quite right. The bill, and I don't think it's a final bill yet. I've heard the figure of £70 million. And you will have heard the Prime Minister say on the floor of the House of Commons that that money would be passported, I think was the word the Prime Minister used. And as far as I'm aware, we still have not received a penny. You'll remember that there was also the Tylerstown slide on the coal tip, and again we were assured that funding would come forward for that, and again it hasn't as yet. What are we doing about it? Well, I was in a meeting with the First Minister and the Secretary of State for Wales probably about 5 weeks ago, where we reiterated the promise that was made to us. And I know that my colleague Rebecca Evans, the Trefnedd and Minister for Finance, has written to the Treasury asking for some assurance about when we will get that funding. You mentioned Pontypridd, and I just want to give the committee, this came from the Chief Executive of NRW, and it's always stuck with me that at the peak of the floods in Pontypridd, the water flowing under the main bridge would have filled an Olympic-sized swimming pool every 3 seconds. And I think that really is an incredibly sobering thought that, as I say, has stuck with me. So I am, absolutely aware of what happened in your constituency, Mick.
Well, Minister, the damage and the impact on business and on people's homes was so significant. The consequences are still there, and there are people who have not yet been able to this day to return home. But what concerns me is this: if the Prime Minister has indeed reneged on that promise that he gave in Parliament to the people of Pontypridd, then there are significant consequences, because decisions have to be taken now about projects which need to be started in April, when the river can be accessed again. There are issues with bridges as well as infrastructure around, alongside the river, roads and so on. What is the plan B at the moment, bearing in mind there is no money actually arriving to Welsh Government? What is the position that, for example, councils like Rhondda are in?
Well, I hope it's too early to say that the Prime Minister's reneged on his promise. As I say, those discussions are ongoing, not just in relation to flooding, but in relation to coal tips, which is obviously a separate piece of work, but they do obviously complement each other. So I think it's too early to say he's reneged on it. We will keep the pressure on. He promised. So for me, if you promise something, then you need to do your very best to deliver it. In relation to, so that's around repairs and the significant repairs. And, I mentioned that I don't think £70 million will be the end of that bill. I'm sure there is still work that the RCT are having to undertake to assess the damage that was done. I mentioned in an earlier answer that we've already put over £4 million, and I think probably a significant majority of that £4.3 million will have gone to RCT because they were so badly affected. And as you say, people still are living with the consequences of the February floods. So the emergency funding is still going out there. Clearly, if we are presented with a bill for £70 million as a Welsh government, that funding would be incredibly difficult to find, and that's why, because it wasn't just Wales that had those horrendous floods in February. There were similar events right across the UK, and further funding on top of the funding that we've had as a Welsh government was clearly promised. So there isn't a plan B as such as to where we would find that £70 million, because we hope we won't be in that position. However, we would have to, utilise the funding that we've got, and I think we've already started to utilise the funding that we've got. But we obviously have to look to the UK government for some of the bigger items that would need that need remediation work, and the coal tips is clearly one of them.
Well, I appreciate those comments. Can I move on to the issue of revenue funding? Of course, the Rhondda Cynon Taf Council, in their submission to you, suggest that one of the problems with existing funding, it is distributed pro rata, but that it isn't made available on the basis of an assessment of where the risks actually exist. This is the point that they make. They say in their submission, however, the funding is not allocated on a risk basis. That is all. Local authorities get the same amount regardless of flood risk within their borough. For example, Rhondda Cynon Taf receives 4.5% of the national revenue funding, but has 21% of the national surface water risk to manage. That seems a reasonable suggestion, does it not, Minister?
So we've already looked at that and acted upon it. We previously provided small amounts of additional revenue to local authorities, as you say, on an application basis. Almost all councils successfully applied for the full amount. So therefore, we kind of thought it would be more straightforward and less burdensome for them. And my very small flood programme team, I have to say, to provide full funding to all 22 local authorities and request annual reports. So, that revenue is a helping hand, as local authorities, should be able to also use their RSG to meet their statutory flood duties. But ultimately, I have to manage limited amounts of revenue that I have to deliver maximum benefit. But, as I say, our capital programme remains prioritised according to risk, but we have changed the revenue, the way we fund local authorities now in relation to revenue.
Well, Minister, one further point then is obviously winter is approaching and people are obviously anxious as to what the impact of climate change is going to be. The situation is far less predictable than it ever was. I mean, in Rhondda Cynon Taf alone, there are 28 incident investigations. There are 8 in Pontypridd and Taff Ely. And of course, the NRW report is extremely important in terms of the concluding of all these statutory reports. You indicated that you have the NRW draft and that it is now towards completion. Are you able to confirm more accurately when that report will be released, and also that when it is released, it will become public so that members of the who have been affected will be able to see the analysis that's taken place?
So I don't have it. I've had sight of the draft report. My understanding is NLW will be publishing that report this month, i.e. October. It certainly will be made public. I think it's incredibly important that all the reports are made public so people can see exactly what was said, what the recommendations are, etc. So there's several Section 19 reports, as you say, from the Rhondda Cynon Taf also. In relation to NRW, what their report, so I say I've seen a draft report, and certainly it does highlight how exceptional the February floods are. I think we really do have to pause to remember how exceptional they were. They went on for several weeks. They were pan whales as well. The report that NRW have done, they reviewed their own performance They'll be setting out recommendations in relation to how they improve response and communication as well. I think it's very right that the draft report I've seen, it praises the staff and the work that, they worked flat out, and they continue to work incredibly hard. And what their review will do is complement the statutory reports from local authorities, which will also be made public as well.
Then one final further point, Minister, is this. You mentioned about coal tips, and of course there are hundreds of coal tips around South Wales. Many are dormant. It appears there's been an investigation into coal pits by the UK government that they have now sat on and are not disclosing. The concern there obviously is it represents a potential adverse information about the state of some of those tips. The Coal Authority, we have always understood, has responsibility for those coal tips. They go back over a century. We can still see them on the hillsides, camouflaged and perhaps modelled as they have been. But they do represent a hazard, as we have seen in Tylerstown. We have obviously a history in terms of coal tips that is something that causes anxiety when it is mentioned. It is a real concern that the statements made by the Prime Minister the other week were that they are giving up all responsibility for those coal tips, and that the Coal Authority has no responsibility for them. Now, it seems to me that must be fundamentally wrong, but represents potentially hundreds of millions of pounds of potential expenditure if that responsibility were to fall upon the Welsh Government. The Tylerstown tip alone, I think, is costing in excess of £10 million. Now, this appears to be another area where the UK government is reneging on its responsibilities. Can you update us on the report that it appears the UK government has obtained? Has that been disclosed to Welsh government? And secondly, what is the legal status of the responsibility for the maintenance of those coal tips?
So you will have heard me say in other places around the significant piece of work that Welsh Government has been doing in relation to coal tips. So following the Tylerstown slip in February, the First Minister set up a summit, I think was the word that was used, in relation to coal tips, and he jointly chaired it with the Secretary of State for Wales. We've now had two summits. The last one was probably September, may have been August, but I would say probably September, where again the First Minister highlighted the need for significant funding to come from the UK government in relation to remediation. Because if we're going to remove that risk around coal tips, we need funding to be able to remediate. Right at the beginning, so back in February, the first summit, the Coal Authority were asked to undertake an assessment of the coal tips in Wales, and we're working very closely with the Coal Authority and the UK government and the local authorities to make sure immediate remediation work is done on the high risk coal tips, whilst we're discussing the funding issue with the UK government. Now, this predates devolution. So, the UK government can't simply just say over to you, Welsh Government, because this predates devolution. And for those of you, and you're probably far, far better than me, than Mick, with your legal knowledge around the Government of Wales Act, we know that anything that predates devolution, predates 1999, the UK government need to provide funding for that. So, I absolutely understand the anxiety of people. And that's why back in February, after the first summit, there was a helpline established for people to ring, to be, to ask questions and to seek reassurance. But the report that you refer to, I certainly haven't seen. I'm not aware the First Minister's seen, but clearly we need to know what the Coal Authority are reporting. I'm going to ask Andy or Gianmarco, I don't know which one would be best to say about the report. Andy's raised his hand to see if officials have seen it, but certainly I haven't, and I'm not aware the First Minister has.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister. In terms of our work through the joint UK Welsh Government task force on this matter, on coal tip safety. We've been, as the Minister said, we've been working closely with the Coal Authority. They are directly responsible for 26 of the coal tips in Wales, and we know that there are over 2,000 across Wales. But we're not aware of any specific reports that have gone to the UK government on this. They have provided local authorities with the outcomes of their ground checks of over 400 high-risk sites, high-risk tips across Wales. So the local authorities have access to all that information, including advice on where extra maintenance work is required. But we're not aware of any overall singular report that's gone to the UK government from the Coal Authority. And as I say, we're working very closely on a daily basis with the Coal Authority on the task force programme.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thank you.